Well, spring is springing, and this is Louisiana versus All Y'all's Recruit That Boot. I'm Jarrett Roser. He's Sam Spiegelman. And a fun fact about me this Tuesday morning is I've already locked myself out of my own cell phone twice and once botched it further to have the extended timeout period. And so it's going great here on a Tuesday morning. It's only 10:15, and we're trying to jump into – we thought a lot of NFL draft talk, kind of looking back at this 25 class, a lot of Louisiana representation, maybe looking ahead to some of the guys to watch in 2026. But there's also a lot of recruiting relevant news popping off, including an LSU transfer commitment, an LSU high school commitment, and now a nationally high-profile linebacker from Alabama is, right up the road from me that I'll actually go see this afternoon. So awful lot to unpack. Sam, how are we doing? Hopefully, a little bit smoother sailing than me this morning.
Yeah, I feel like embarrassed. I have no embarrassing tales to share. I just want to be there for you and let you know that, like, as we get older, which we certainly are, I definitely can feel that every single day. Life just gets a little bit harder. So, don't beat yourself up. It comes with the territory.
I'm still young and invincible and on the top of my game, and nothing has changed in the 15 years or whatever. I don't know that we've been kicking around doing this, getting damn near.
It's getting pretty close.
Let's get into it. Let's get into it. Before we get into some of the draft stuff, and now I'm chewing on ice at an inopportune moment. So just, again, going great so far on Tuesday morning, but we will get into some of the NFL draft stuff, but even more recently than that, a couple of notable additions to this LSU, the next two, I guess, theoretically LSU classes. Let's talk about the 26 guy first. He's a guy that we've talked about prior on this channel, and he was someone that I think by this point you and I both expected Havon Finney Jr. to probably end up in this 26 LSU class. Don't know that either one of us realized Mom's birthday was coming up and the commitment and not top 3 announcement was coming on Mom's birthday, but he surprised an awful lot of people with that commitment. And so timeline-wise, at least caught some folks off guard. But Havon Finney Jr., a blue-chip cornerback prospect from California, is now another member of this really, really star-studded early LSU class for 26.
Yeah, this was Corey Raymond's quote-unquote guy for the 2027 class, and then proceedingly the 2026 class, and really huge move for Corey and BK to get them to commit early on. Obviously, with reclassifying, the whole timeline gets expedited. But like as you mentioned off air, I mean, he's made several visits to Baton Rouge this offseason alone. In doing this move, they consulted with Corey Raymond. They made sure that everything had lined up. They had longtime interest in Baton Rouge. He fits the Corey Raymond mold of these long, athletic, elite, speedy corners that, have consistently, they've turned out in Baton Rouge. Getting a chance to see him a month or so ago, I was extremely impressed with how he moves at his size and with his frame. Loved his instinct. I loved his, I call it peskiness, just corners just kind of smacking around. And I love that. I want him to be feisty and play with a little bit of a chip. And for a kid from California, he certainly does that. So great move for LSU. I know that they're not done in the defensive secondary, but nice blue chip piece after missing out on 5-star Blaine Bradford a little bit earlier in the spring. They come right back and find another blue chipper to add to the secondary.
He's another one of these guys that you kind of interact with off the field, and you see kind of a mild-mannered guy, very easy, go with the flow. He's a sharp kid. Even when he's not talking, you kind of see the wheels turning and keeping up with everything that's going on. And then he gets out there, and he's a dog out there on the perimeter. Even as a young player, we watched, play with that Flow 7-on-7 team last year, and he was one of the young guys on that group. He was a guy that was joining a group that he probably had less familiarity and connection with than a lot of the other members of that team. And he just jumped in there and was quickly a top corner, matching up against top receivers from all over the country who are a year, 2 years older than him, and not only holding his own, but making plays. And it's really exciting to look forward to what the future could look like with him on one side of that field and DJ Pickett on the other. Another key piece of Corey Raymond just trying to, restock and rebuild that that DBU secondary. Corey got back middle of last January. They announced he was coming back to Baton Rouge. Havon, at that point, still a freshman in high school, before reclassifying this year, was an offer that was in the first 2 weeks, I think, of Corey being back on LSU staff. And you could hear from Havon by the time that spring game rolled around that he was really admiring LSU and Corey and loving the relationship there quite a bit. And it just continued to grow and grow past year plus, to a point where now he's, a guy that's going to be here, later this year, I guess, theoretically, or early next year. And so really exciting there for sure. And if folks have been with us since last year, they remember some of the criticisms early on of Corey, and they hadn't gotten a cornerback prospect, hadn't gotten a quarterback commitment yet, and what's going on. And now Jabari Antoine's going to Miami and all these things. And we said, look, be patient. He just got back here. It's going to take him some time to kind of rebuild some things. Recruiting is a relationship process still. And I mean, one hell of a job for him once again to add another of the nation's top cornerbacks in Havon Finney Jr.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. When coaches, especially, assistant coaches, position coaches change jobs, it's great when they're able to immediately impact the current recruiting cycle. It's very difficult to do because as kids approach their senior seasons, their timelines to make decisions is already ahead of where it used to be. We used to see decisions in, October, November, December. Then we saw them increasingly move closer to August, right before the season, Jamboree season, preseason. And now we're seeing it on the back end of official visits because, they take so much stock in spring visits and junior days, and then they take their OVs. And, after 4 or 5 visits in the offseason to each of these contenders, they kind of already know where they want to go. And that's not to say that they always stick there. Let's make that be said. So, with Corey Raymond, he was able to kind of pull the magic and pull DJ Pickett out of the state of Florida last year, which was, hats off, let him cook, and look at him continuing to ride that momentum, getting Havon Finney in the bag early. They made a big move with Hayward Howard in state, despite offering a late offer in March. The way that Corey Raymond does it's a little bit different, which you have to, hats off in this year to be able to do things the way that he does, but it's methodical, and his touch, kids and their parents generally respect and gravitate toward it.
And you mentioned Hayward, obviously in-state guy, and we talked about when Hayward got that offer. He's a young guy for his 2026 grade. I don't know in terms of where the birthdays fall with him and Havon, but it's 2 guys that'll be in that 26 class. Theoretically, we think that Hayward Howard ends up in this class as well. I don't think I'm getting over my skis in terms of at least our predictions with that, but that's 2 guys that for that grade will be long, lean, speedy corners that are still young for that class. And just the future is increasingly bright in Baton Rouge with that secondary group with Corey Raymond, obviously, and also shout out working with the safeties, Jake Olson, who does a great job with that, particular position group. LSU also got a more immediate boost this weekend with Saturday morning, the announcement, Bernard Gooden, the transfer from USF, that he'd be joining that defensive line front. I don't know how much you got a chance to watch him. He's obviously an Alabama guy, which is still within your range of the region, but it's not your where your heart lies in the boot and in Texas quite as much. But Bernard Gooden, a big defensive lineman who started his college career at Wake Forest, went over to USF, and this year was the top graded run defender on that defensive front for the USF Bulls defense. Showed the ability to get some push up front as well. Had, I think on PFF 27 hurries in 13 games. And so a little over 2 hurries per game, along with some of the other statistics that come there with what he was able to do as a versatile defensive lineman. And now he's heading to Baton Rouge, where they have put a clear emphasis in that transfer portal on the defensive front this year. And going into the transfer portal for the spring window, Brian Kelly mentioned he thought it could be a really quiet window for LSU unless they thought there was just too good of an opportunity to pass up. And apparently Bernard Gooden is someone that coaching staff looked at and said, the addition that he could be to this group is too good to pass up, and let's go make a move on him. How much do you know about Gooden thus far? And just as LSU tries to, we talk so much about the future being bright. LSU's trying to do some things in 2025 right away. So just kind of what that addition can mean for this defense up front for that coaching staff.
Yeah, you could say it was too good and to be true for Brian Kelly and company. Listen, if you're taking stock of this spring window of the transfer portal, you notice what a lot of these contenders, particularly in the SEC, have been doing, and that's loading up across the defensive line. You know, LSU obviously stocked up on both sides of the trenches during the earlier windows, and then they found another player that can bolster their rotation, add some depth to their run defense, like you said. PFF, it was a PFF's top run defender for USF last year. And shout out to my people in Mobile, shout out to my people in Montgomery, and of course, people near and dear to my heart up in Birmingham. I love the great state of Alabama. Let's not talk about where they stand in the overall power rankings, but let's put some respect on Gooden's name and where he comes from, man. The Yellowhammer State, they call it. So yeah, I just think, you saw Texas do this, you saw Oklahoma do this. You're seeing LSU do this. It's important to not only have the stars up front, but have depth behind them, and Gooden will be another piece for that interior for Blake Baker and company to utilize.
Another guy from out there in the old Yellowhammer State that is, maybe that much nearer and dearer to Sam's heart than I realized. JaMichael Garrett is now, as I mentioned, right up the road in central Louisiana, just a couple minutes from me. That's where I'll be for spring practices Tuesday afternoon. And there'd been kind of some buzz with him throughout the spring of where is he? Is he in Louisiana? Is he at Carr? We had talked about a couple weeks ago, and then I kind of heard through the grapevine last week that he was over at Central and was eager to get to Central spring practice as quickly as I could to try and maybe even have an interview with him before it was announced where he was. And then he kind of put out the schedule on Monday of, hey, coaches, here's where I'm at. Come check me out. And so an Auburn commit, a highly ranked, national level Auburn committed linebacker is now, right in the backyard in Baton Rouge. Tell folks here, including myself, who is familiar with JaMichael a little bit, but, certainly hasn't watched a ton of him, what to expect from that guy joining a reigning state championship defense up there with Coach Semino and Coach Camp and company, as well as a guy that I mentioned is an Auburn commit, and LSU fans want to know now that he's here, like, how much should we be paying attention to him? I know some other SEC programs have remained in contact as well. Just what is kind of the rundown on JaMichael Garrett and what to know about him as he kicks off his Louisiana finish to his high school career?
Yeah, one of the early pieces in Auburn's 2026 class, he committed to Auburn last summer during Big Cat Weekend. And when I did one of many Mobile tours last fall, this was a defensive player that coaches up and down the Gulf Coast around the Mobile area were talking about. Have you seen the Auburn commit at Gulf Shores? Really energizer bunny, sort of second level defender. Flies to the football, can play off the ball linebacker, which he does largely. But I think ultimately can be one of those inside guys. He's not exactly the biggest linebacker in the world. He's a top 20 prospect at the position. But he's a bulldozer. He's a physical, thirsty for physical contact defender. He can add to your pressure packages. He's stout against the run, covering sideline to sideline. And what we've seen with Flo this entire offseason is I think you can put him in that as a big nickel defender because he's kind of just a more physical safety, and he's really good dropping back into coverage. So I think long-term he's going to play in the middle of this defense as an inside backer. But you talked about Coach Camp and what he did last year with so many of those weapons for Central en route to a state championship run. We know they have pieces coming back in the defensive secondary. I wouldn't be surprised if they use JaMichael a little bit more closer to the line of scrimmage, let him wreak a little bit more havoc there. Obviously, they need to replace the pass rusher of the Houston signee, DK Mays, and his brother, who was extremely productive in that role last year. From a recruiting standpoint, yeah, look, LSU and Ole Miss are two new teams that I think are going to take a look at JaMichael. But he's been committed to Auburn, like I said, since last summer. This spring, he's made a visit out to Texas A&M, which has come on very strong. Miami is another team that has been in his ear since January when he made that visit for their big junior day. And of course, Deion Sanders is talking to JaMichael. This is kind of fits the profile of a Deion Sanders target. But I'd also throw LSU now that he's going to be in their backyard. We'll definitely get him on campus, and keep an eye on your boy Pete Golding over at Ole Miss. He loves to find this kind of tier of talent in Louisiana. I wouldn't be surprised if he could pique his interest when he's on the road this spring.
I for sure think that, JaMichael becomes one of the top 10 or so ranked prospects in Louisiana to watch in this 26 class, and what is a really fantastic top group in Louisiana for 2026, and that his recruiting process is a long way from over. And obviously Auburn is the kind of pole position team there with the commitment from last summer that we talk about. But I think that some of those other schools that you mentioned are going to have an awful lot to say between now and signing day. And so we suddenly have a new character in 26 for Louisiana fans to want to keep an eye on. That seems like he's going to be someone that there is a lot to keep an eye on with over the coming months.
No arguments from me. Bring on the juice.
And I know when you say bring on the juice, you're excited also as we watch the recruiting processes play out. You're excited to just talk some more about this NFL draft situation. That's what the plan was before things started popping left and right around us in terms of news elements. As we look back at this 2025 NFL draft, and a lot of those guys that we talked about last week, Will Campbell ends up where we expected him to at number 4 to the New England Patriots, kicks off a 7 LSU Tiger draft, a 10 Louisiana native draft. And what else kind of caught your eye of just, there are storylines certainly, but also fits and opportunities for some of these guys in what will be the first home of their professional career?
Yeah, try to notice some of the draft trends. What are the traits that NFL general managers and front offices are truly coveting? And I love this because of just obviously it's a topic year in, year out, but concerns about size of the position sometimes, whether it's a receiver or a DB or a quarterback. And when it comes to the skill position players, more than height, weight, anything, speed is a key ingredient. If you can move, they're going to find a role for you. So it's whether if it's in the first round as a blue chip player, is it a day 2 pick that maybe you are a little on the shorter side, or maybe you don't have that elite catch radius. But if you can move, they're going to find a home for you. And even if that's on special teams on day 3, which we saw plenty of. Quarterbacks, listen, you could talk about as many different aspects, but what it boils down to is accuracy and decision making and the way that you present yourself. And we saw that obviously front and center with Shedeur. We talked about it, I believe, on air about, I've covered Shedeur since he was a sophomore in high school over at Trinity. The way he's presented himself has always been the same. So to see him fall, it definitely, being a first round pick, I never saw that in him. Day 2 pick, right, for sure could see that. But I think, you see this in this NIL driven world where rankings are so critical and NIL value is also critical. How you present yourself about this, you have to understand it's an ingredient, but there's more to it. And Kyle McCord was a 5-star and he was a 7th round pick. And Cam Ward wasn't ranked. We know these stupid stories. We've heard them quite a bit. But they reign true. It's everyone faces adversity, whether you don't like your ranking or you didn't even get ranked. But it doesn't matter at the end of the day. It's about moving forward and the attitude you possess. Can it be a chip on your shoulder? Of course. But let's not make it the focal point of conversations with general managers. You know what I'm saying? And I think Shedeur proved that. And then the emphasis on the trenches. Offensive and defensive line are always at a premium. But when it comes to edge rushers, and I was having this conversation, the long bendy guys on the outside that can just, rush the passer with speed. Yeah, they're very productive, particularly in high school, but you need to be able to set the edge in the run, and you need to be more of a 3-down player, not a designated pass rusher. They will take chances on you as DPRs. But I was really kind of taken aback. even someone like James Pierce, who's one of those speedy edge rushers. I think the stats show that maybe one of the last 19 guys drafted with those sort of traits and numbers really panned out at the NFL. So not only is it about fit, but it's about traits, and it's about being a more multiple, versatile player moving forward. So that's all things that I'm trying to keep into mind as we evaluate players. Listen, there are really great high school players, and taking that into account is, of course, essential. Nothing is more important than the skills on the field. But when you look at these draft trends, when you're trying to do a ranking that reflects the NFL draft and the pecking order, speed and traits are paramount.
We won't spend a ton of time talking about the Shedeur stuff. He's not a Louisiana guy. It was certainly the storyline of the draft this weekend on a national scale. And I think, maybe Mel Kiper Jr. is still losing sleep over it a few days later as he tries to kind of come to terms with the fact that Shedeur ends up being a 5th round draft pick. He was a guy that I, like you, didn't really think was going to end up being a 1st round pick. And I think a lot of that just became overhyped, whether it be from a level of media coverage or the fan attention, or self-generated by the Sanders family and some of the things that Dion talked about with, my kid's going to be a top 5 pick, mark that, and all those things. He's somebody that if you watched the bulk of draft analysts leading up to the event, it was looking like, will he potentially be a guy that a team maybe trades up and catches late in the 1st round? But even the likelihood of that seeming like it was probably more of a day 2 type thing. I didn't expect him to slide to the 5th round, but I think for folks that were confused, surprised, frustrated, up in arms to different degrees over the course of the weekend, I think about it from a recruiting standpoint. And I think we saw kind of a combination of 2 things that we deal with on pretty much a daily basis, where there are student athletes and families that overinflate what their value level is for what they actually bring to the table from an athletic standpoint, and kind of have the potential, if they don't handle a process well, to talk themselves out of some opportunities by the way that they approach things and go about their business, because they have a little bit of an inflated view of where that value lies in the grand scheme of things, and how they stack up against some of their peers in some ways. And there's also a dynamic of kind of hand in hand with that, whether it be NFL, NBA, any sport, really any business. If there's somebody that has a level of red flag, but a level of talent that exceeds that, the greater your talent, the more likely an organization of any standpoint is going to overlook some of those red flags. But if the talent level is maybe not quite where you thought it was, then suddenly mid-level or even lower level red flags become a kind of stopping point when evaluating you, because they feel like the talent doesn't overwhelm some of those question marks. And I think we saw some of those things play out with Shedeur in also a draft class where not as many teams were looking for quarterbacks to plug in right away. And so it was really interesting to watch. And if you're a parent that's sitting there ticked off that Shedeur is getting overlooked because you think he's a 1st round guy, and suddenly he's in the 5th round, and it was relatively small question marks in the grand scheme of things, no legal issues or anything like that, no injury issues. It was smaller deals that still ended up costing him. As you approach things with your kid in a recruiting process, keep in mind what you just watched and the frustration levels that you watched for a kid that you thought was a 1st round NFL guy, and now you're sitting there with a 2-star or 3-star high school prospect and snapping at college coaches. So just kind of be aware of the way that some of these things all kind of play out over time. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. Is the juice worth the squeeze? And I think we all got the answer to that question, and it's a real question. Like you said, people, general managers, coaches will tolerate a lot more when you have elite talent. You could look at someone like George Pickens, who is one of the best receivers I've ever laid my eyes on. But the stories you hear about what it takes to keep him focused on the field is outrageous. And I know that Mike Tomlin has dealt with it, but how much longer? That's just a perfect example. You'll get more chances when you have that talent, but people are less willing and they're less patient now more than ever to deal with it when you don't. So be aware. Self-awareness is a key attribute when you get older.
Yeah, I mean, the more that you can have some level of self-awareness now in a world where we're all connected to everything all the time, and every movement a kid makes ends up being seen on social media, whether because of the coverage levels of sports at each level, or just because kids are putting everything that they do on social media more than ever before. I told you we watched the Mel Kiper. Folks were talking about meltdown over a course of a 3-day span, and for as silly as it seemed at times, as extreme as it seemed at times, when he kind of went at the entirety of the NFL and saying that no one there has any clue how to evaluate quarterbacks, as though it's not a hit or miss game for everyone, and he doesn't have plenty of misses on his resume through the years as well. I told you we could maybe have an opportunity to talk about who are guys that you felt strongly about in some recruiting classes that maybe were not being viewed as highly by some other peers or by some colleges or whatnot, but that you could see yourself going to bat as strongly, or, you know, close to as strongly as Mel was for Shador, because as silly as the packaging kind of got to be at points with that. Also, you know, credit to Mel for having some conviction in his evaluations and for going to bat for a student athlete that he felt like was a better prospect than was being given credit for in the draft. Do you have a guy or two that you've kind of zeroed in on, and kind of take me through some of that of someone that you could see yourself on ESPN just losing it because they're not getting their due?
Yeah, put me on ESPN. That's a good idea. Well, looking back at this 21 class, now there's a couple that I wouldn't say maybe I was alone on, but I can tell you I was first on. Mason Smith, who ended up being a second-round pick of the Jaguars. We had him as the number 1 defensive lineman in the country. Donovan Jackson, I think eventually was consensus a 5-star, but your boy was on him first. As a number 1 offensive guard, he was a first-round pick, of course, of Minnesota. Jalen Milroe, we had high. We had him as a 77 overall. Obviously got drafted at the end of round 2, I believe. He was a guy that I would, even though the accuracy issues were there, which they still obviously are presenting themselves, enormous upside at a premium position, athletic traits through the roof. And right behind Jalen, by the way, we were the highest, or I was the highest, on a kid named Garrett Nussmeier out of Marcus Flower Mounds, who I compared to Brett Favre. Nailed it. And then the last one in that class, well, 2 more. Savion Jones, I think obviously he didn't turn out as high of a draft pick, but obviously someone who had a really great development and career at LSU, still got drafted, was so impressed after we saw him in downtown Battery. And then someone we'll hear this year, JaMichael Sturdivant, playing for Florida. LSU recruited him, by the way, as well. And Andrew Makuba and Elijah Arroyo were 2 more of my guys from Texas in that class. Makuba was a day 3 pick. Elijah was a day 2 pick. 2 guys that I put my stamp on in that class as well.
Hey, don't downplay some of these guys that are, mid-round type guys. Savion is a 3rd-round draft pick this year. And so, again,
that's where we had him.
For student athletes, families, whoever, just because you're not one of the top 32 drafted players in the entire country doesn't mean that you're not a fantastic prospect. Obviously, I mean, only 200, all the high school football players around this country, all the high school football players just in this region that we cover, the thousands every single year that we're watching. And then you expand that over the course of an entire country, 252 guys heard their names called this weekend in that draft. And so that's as elite and small percentage of a group as you can get. And so Savion right there, a guy that you mentioned his development over the course of his high school career, really, I don't want to say he became a different player, but he came out at 235, maybe a speedy long edge rusher, and goes into the league at 285 and, probably a 3-4 defensive end, but up there in Denver, but has some schematic versatility to his game and becomes.
But to our point earlier, he ran I believe a 4.7 40 at St. James.
Yeah.
at that testing day when Shaz ran the sub 4.5, and Savion ran a 4.7 at 235. But if he was just an edge defender, which again, in his high school career, being able to come off the edge with that authority, with that conviction and bend as well as he did, I can remember leaving downtown Vatry and sending out the tweet. I was like, I think he's the best edge defender in the Southeast and in this particular cycle. And he really did, but putting on the weight and learning to play inside, learning to be a stout run defender first, and having just enough juice in his back pocket to be a pass rusher. Like you said, that's why Sean Payton took a draft pick on him on day 2.
Says a lot about him. We talk so much about Sean Payton, the former Saints coach, trading up Jamar Cain, a guy that was at LSU,
right?
And so clearly knows it's in Savion Jones. I think the fact that they traded up and didn't want to let somebody else potentially steal him, that they put that value on him, says a lot about Savion and his game. And looking at the guys that got drafted, I was actually going through kind of almost a self-scout, gauging where I had guys ranked within the state of Louisiana for Prep Red Zone Louisiana as it compared to some of the other the bigger recruiting networks, and feel like I did pretty well for myself with having Will Campbell. And some of these are just by a spot here, 2 spots there. Had Will Campbell higher than Rivals 247 or on 3, had Jack Besh higher than Rivals 247 or on 3, had Emory Jones higher than 247 or Rivals. The same as on 3. Savion higher than 247 Rivals, was 1 behind on 3. And then as I'm going through this, I feel pretty good in retrospect about how I had some of these guys ranked. I will say the guy that I missed on more than any of guys that we've heard drafted in the last 2 classes now, a guy that you should probably credit yourself for some too. I was a few spots behind where when you were at Rivals, had Trevor Etienne, but I was still ahead of on 3 and 247. And so while I was still ahead of 2 of the 3 bigger recruiting networks, baby Etienne brother was certainly a Sam Spiegelman favorite in that class, which was a really good running back class with not just him and Dylan Sampson, but a slew of others.
Yeah. So to me, I only have so much say in the overall pecking order of the 250, or, in other places, the pecking order. So to me, I more applaud myself that I got him. Hey, this was a draftable kid. This is, a guy like we said, I put my stamp on. Like Mason, I had to go to town banging on banging the drums for, to get him ranked and to get him to the 5-star set. We're going to get into this next class coming up. But there are guys that I stood on the table for, and then when I changed jobs, they got their 5th stars taken away. But they're still my guys, so I can't keep track of all where they were slotted, what order. But if I put my stamp on them, that's what I stand by.
The Sam Spiegelman stamp of approval.
Exactly, all S's, alliteration, plenty.
I was thinking of a way to sub out the approval for another S word and make it 4 S's, but I couldn't get there in time. But a lot of these guys, man, were so much fun to cover, and you end up with, on top of just the excitement for what they can bring to their franchises, all of these storylines. Savion Jones, the first St. James draftee since 2005. Corey Webster, a guy that is held so high in such high regard down there in the River Parish, certainly, and obviously Baton Rouge with a national championship, and then on to Super Bowls with the Giants. The Etienne brothers, looking at Pro Football Reference, I think are the only 2 guys out of Jennings High who have been drafted into the NFL. So what a heck of a storyline for those 2 guys to be draftees and represent that school at that level. And then, just on down the list. But you mentioned, we mentioned last week, we wanted to look a little bit ahead, and it's way too early. It's April. We're almost a full calendar year ahead of this 2026 draft. But for folks that are trying to start to get the early sense of who are going to be some Louisiana relevant guys that we need to monitor over this next year and maybe on in the fall as their season plays out, who are Louisiana relevant guys that you kind of have top of mind as this 2026 draft class starts to kind of have its early formation?
The quarterback at LSU should hear his name pretty early.
Yeah.
Nussmeier, I think midway through the season was certainly one of those 1st-round projections. And I think in this sort of class, he would have stood really tall with his traits. And given the other quarterbacks that were draft eligible, Harold Perkins is, of course, coming back for his senior year, but we're talking about the versatility of the second level defender. This is Harold's chance. We thought we'd see that last year before injury. Obviously what a dynamic edge presence he was during his early time at LSU. I think if he's able to show that he's a true electric sort of linebacker star, we're talking about the value that NFL teams put on that position. And with those traits, I could see him being one of those potentially second half of the first round sort of defenders that teams have their eyes on. With a big year, I think that Quincy Wiggins could be a year for Quincy Wiggins. We talk about traits, whether we know that he has an NFL frame, we know that he's a multi-sport athlete, has always needed to kind of put it together. He'll have that opportunity at Colorado this season. And then the other name, the elephant in the room, would be Arch Manning, but I don't think that we're going to have to deal with that. I don't think that Arch will declare after his junior season. I do have a story coming on this later this week, but from what I understand, all signs right now, and no decision has been made. No, it is way too early in the process, but the sense is that he's going to stay through his senior season in Austin. That's the expectation. They're going to be very good this year, whether they come away with a championship or come close again. I think that he'll give it at least 2 shots. He loves Texas. He loves the university. He loves this staff. So for, guys waiting to see if the Saints will draft a Manning or, if the Jets will need to draft a Manning, I think it'll still be 2 more years.
Look, I don't see why Arch would be in any rush to get out of Austin and be, risk being farther from you than he's ever been in his young football career. If he had to leave
I was looking at games for this fall since I'll be on paternity leave, and I don't, I'm trying to figure out if there's even a game, but can you come back for your senior season? Because that's when the real games are getting played. So, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to watching Garrett Nussmeier this fall and seeing where he ends up in next year's draft, because I do think it's going to be very high on that board in 2026. I agree with you on Arch that as much as we're looking forward to watching him this fall, and a long way still between now and a decision on what happens for him and potentially leaving for the 26th draft or not, that if I was betting right now, I would certainly be betting on the fact that he'll be back and be a member of that 27 draft. You mentioned Harold Perkins. I think the emergence of Whit Weeks, if he comes back healthy and looks like himself from last year, has the opportunity to be huge for Perk, because if you can rely on Whit to hold down the role that he played, it frees up that much more that you can do with Perk on that LSU defense. And looking, at some other Louisiana guys who are now elsewhere, that as much as we'll be keeping an eye on a lot of these LSU guys, which for fans here that really want to focus on purple and gold, keep an eye on a couple of these Louisiana wide receivers, also Aaron Anderson and Chris Hilton, and the type of years they may have this fall and what that can do for their draft stock in 2026. But if other programs are a little bit more outside of view for y'all, and you do want to keep some level of tabs though on some of these Louisiana natives that are at other programs, I think Le'Veon Moss at Texas A&M, how he comes back this fall, which all indications from College Station are that he's coming back really strong, and they expect him to be pretty full go by this summer and heading into camp and all those things. I think he has a chance to be an early round draft pick. I'm interested to see how Amarion Miller up there at Colorado comes back from his injury, a guy that we've seen some great flashes from with the Buffs the last couple of years, a guy that can go up and get the ball against any defender. Jaden Osbury, one of our guys up there at Notre Dame, what kind of year does he have this year up there in South Bend? Kendrick Law, who's at Kentucky now. We talked so much about speed dynamics earlier. Right. If you want somebody that can absolutely go get the ball in his hands, Kendrick Law fits that mold. And so watching what kind of season he can put on tape this fall. And then another one I jotted down, Cyrus Allen, who was at A&M. He's now up at Cincinnati in that setting, and probably a little bit more of a focal point for that offense. What can he potentially do with the Bearcats? He's someone I think, maybe not as as highly necessarily of a ceiling as some of these other guys we talk about. But I don't think as far off as maybe some fans might think, because he's been a name that's been a little bit more under the radar through his college career, but a kid that I really like, coming out of New Orleans.
Yeah, that's a great list. A couple of names I didn't think of. Jaden Ausberry had such a sensational season last year. I know that he's we're talking about linebackers, has to be at or near the top. I know that even after Notre Dame's title game run, a lot of teams around the country were hoping and wishing that he would enter the portal. So see him come back to South Bend, another year playing for Marcus Freeman, who he absolutely loves. Would not be surprised to see Jaden either late first, really a day 2 pick for his position. Just going to be such a great NFL linebacker.
And another one to throw in there, because I was pretty light on the trenches, but similarly to Quincy Wiggins, that we've been waiting to kind of hit that potential that we saw from him in high school. Lance Hurd, who's at Tennessee now, started for the Volunteers this year. A bit of an up and down season, I think, in his role, looking through some of the PFF grades and things like that. But somebody that we loved coming out of high school, think his size and traits that he brings to the table has to be a really good offensive lineman. And so watching the type of fall that he puts together is certainly worth monitoring for some Louisiana fans.
We spent a lot of last week talking about Will Campbell's arm length and wingspan. And when NFL teams get a whiff of what Lance Hurd's wingspan looks like, we'll be hearing his name pretty early in the 2026 NFL draft.
There you go. He's Sam Spiegelman. I'm Jet Roser. I don't know how we got to all of the topics that we got to today, because when everything started popping off on the recruiting front, I didn't think we'd get into all of the 25 and 26 draft, but we cruised through it a little bit, and Sam, certainly appreciate the opportunity to chop it up with you on all of that.
Yes, sir. Say hi to Coach Simino today for me.